Hello to everybody, and welcome back to our third study in the Book of Ecclesiastes. We are in chapter 3 today, and if you would like the PDF that we've got for this chapter, you can download it for free on our website. There's a link down in the description. So in the first chapter, we talked about Solomon declaring that all of life is vanity. In the second chapter, we talked about how he kind of came to that conclusion. He had tested all these offerings of the world, and he had found that none of them brought meaning, lasting satisfaction, purpose to life. Chapter 3, I think, is a little bit harder to understand, but I think we can make sense of it and how it fits into the larger picture. That's what we're going to talk about today. So let's go over our brief chapter summary before we get into the details. This is what I have for today. The cycle of the earth repeats itself continually, and everything happens in its appointed time according to God's design. Solomon's going to talk about how God created mankind with a knowledge of eternity, with at least a limited knowledge of spiritual things and their existence, although he has kept much of his work secret from us. Injustice is also going to be discussed, the prevalence of injustice on the earth, but that there will be a time when God will bring judgment on those injustices. Okay, so now let's talk about the details of chapter 3 and break it down. I've got 3 sections again today. The first section is kind of famous. You hear it quoted somewhat often if you're kind of running in biblical circles. So it's verses 1 through 8, the repeating patterns of life and a time for everything. So Solomon lists the repeating seasons, events, blessings, and the difficulties of life. These events touch all human beings, and they are beyond any human being's ability to manipulate or change. For me, the most difficult part of this section is asking, well, how does this fit into the discussion that we're already having in the larger context of Ecclesiastes? I think Solomon's intention in making this list, it seems to be to reinforce his point about the vanity of life and not trying to find satisfaction on this earth. That a human shouldn't seek happiness in circumstances because circumstances are always changing and it will always be that way. I wanted to read this section, verses 2 through 8 to you because, as I mentioned, you hear it quoted quite a bit and it's a really interesting section of scripture. A time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. The heading for section number 2 comes directly from the text. That which is already has been, that which is to be already has been, verses 9 through 15. So while this cycle of the earth may seem monotonous in some ways, Solomon saw that God had built beauty into this repeating cycle. God had made, quote, everything beautiful in its time, verse 11. Now, as I mentioned in the brief introduction, God has kept many things secret from mankind. Much of his work is hidden from us, and the way that he manages his intricate world. But Solomon had found out that God had instilled the concept of eternity and a basic concept of the existence of God in the spiritual realm into all human beings. And I think we see that throughout history. No matter where you go, no matter what the culture is like, they're always worshiping something. They know there's something greater out there. So what do you do in this endless cycle of the world? Solomon determined that the best thing that a man could do was to work hard, find satisfaction in his labor, receive God's good gifts in their season, and try to do good with them for both himself and for other people. Humans are living in God's world, and we can't change what he's ordained or change the seasons that he's fixed. Living through the repeated cycles of the world is intended to teach us about God and teach us to respect him. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in our application section. But now, on to section number 3, verses 16 through 22. God will judge the righteous and the wicked. In these concluding verses of chapter 3, Solomon talks about God's final judgment and the fate of the souls of all mankind. And I want to mention here again, it's not exactly clear how much God had revealed to Solomon about the eternal destiny of righteous and wicked souls. I don't think Solomon knew as much as we know now after all the revelation that we've received through Jesus and the apostles. But he did know that the earth currently was full of injustice, and that's probably still true today. Injustice that went unpunished. And he expressed his confidence that God would one day judge all men fairly in his time. Right? So there's a time for injustice, but there's also going to be a time for justice. And Solomon is going to express this confidence again towards the end of the book in chapter 12, verse 14. And next, Solomon writes to us more from this purely physical, earthly perspective that he's been writing from. This pretty much everything ends in the grave perspective. From a purely earthly perspective, the eternal destiny of men was indistinguishable from the eternal destiny of animals. Right? Men die and decay, animals die and decay. There's no way of really telling what happens to the spirit of a man versus the spirit of an animal after death. And from this purely earthly, physical perspective, the best thing that a man can do is just to find a way to enjoy his journey through life, because what's on the other side of death is a mystery. With this perspective that Solomon is describing, life certainly is vain. It has no real purpose, and it has no meaningful conclusion. For our application today, I want to just briefly touch on this concept of the repeating seasons and the repeating cycles of the earth. The seasons are a natural clock for us that existed long before real, physical, technological clocks ever existed. And they mark the passing of time, and they teach us things. So I want to encourage you, don't go through the seasons of the year without letting them remind you of the Creator and His purposes. The seasons aren't just about holidays and the weather that you prefer. There's a lot of spiritual applications and spiritual lessons that we can learn from their repeated cycles. So try to think about that as you go through the weeks and as the seasons turn over, and let me know if you can think of any spiritual applications or lessons from the seasons down in the comments section. That's our study from Ecclesiastes 3, and Lord willing, we'll be back tomorrow to tackle chapter 4.